My name is Karen Hill. I'm in Victoria, and today is the 29th of March, 1984. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Today I'm interviewing Miss Bessie Snyder, who's had long experience in social welfare in British Columbia. Miss Snyder, in order to get underway, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born and a little bit about your early life.
Well, I was born in Kirbyville, Ontario, a little town near the city of Belleville on the Bay of Quinte. I was born March the 17th, 1905, a twin sister. And my father was a farmer, and I'm with my twin, the eldest of 7 children. There were 5 girls, 2 boys. And there are a sister and a brother who are dead. The others are living. And I'm the single one of the family. And we had our public school in Ontario. Dad brought us just towards the end of the First World War to Saskatchewan because as a young boy and young man, his dream was to go west, young man. And when his father died, he was the only boy and he had 2 sisters. He felt that he would move his big family. So he did, and we came to a farm in Saskatchewan, Rosetown, Saskatchewan. That's a lovely name. It was a lovely area, beautiful farming country. And I completed my high school in Rosetown, and then at that time we could take, I think it was a 3 or 4 month course in normal teacher training, and then go teaching, which I did. And I enjoyed my teaching. I taught, I have to recall now, 1, 2, 3. I taught, well, I was teaching when I was 18, at 23, and then taught 3 years and went back to complete my normal training, which would be I think it again would be just a 3 month course. I went, no, yes, I went again in January and finished in May. It would be a 4 months course. You know, I'm hazy about that. Mm-hmm. But anyway, then you had to continue teaching, or you got your first class certificate for 3 years. You had to have good inspector's reports. And I was able to, become a teacher with first class certificate, of which I was very proud. And then I decided, well, I was going to go to university, and I was able to put myself through university. And when I think of students now with student grants, student bursaries, there's no such thing. Mm-hmm.
Where did you go to university?
University of Saskatchewan. And I went first in 29. Then I went back to my school in which I'd been teaching, taught another year, and I took extra courses. So then I came back, finished my year, and I graduated in 31 with BA. And I took history and languages. Then I was fortunate enough to get the vice principal of a school, Elbow, Saskatchewan, the southern part of Saskatchewan. And then, I continued teaching high school. When I was teaching the last school in Carlisle, South Saskatchewan, my vice principal said, Bessie, you have to be a social worker. And I was enjoying teaching because I enjoyed youngsters, got along with youngsters. And I didn't know anything about social work. But I went for the summer months, volunteered to go into the family agency in Regina. and I enjoyed my experience there. And I can't remember the director there, and I can't even remember her assistant. But anyway, part of the training was taking mothers in Saskatchewan to a summer camp, which would be a little camp at a lake that was just a slough in effect. But those mothers with their small children had never had a holiday for years. This was, you see, in the Dropshires of Saskatchewan. And I thought, yes, I think I'd like to be a social worker. And then my friend who had talked with me applied with me to the School of Social Work in Vancouver and the School of Social Work in Toronto. The only other School of Social Work was the School of Social Work in Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
And we were accepted to first the Vancouver School. So we came out in September, and we took that first year social work diploma.
When was that?
But that would be 37 and 38.
Mm-hmm.
And I took my field work over here in the family agency in Victoria, and Miss McLaughlin was the director here then, and I enjoyed that experience very well. And I determined in the course that I would go into social welfare because I wanted to work in the country. I didn't want to work in Vancouver or for Victoria for that matter, or I enjoyed Victoria. You know, at that time I was playing a lot of tennis, and then I laugh now because we were able to play tennis on the tennis courts outside the Parliament buildings, and it was considered then that civil servants didn't do any work. They had time, you know, even to have tea in the afternoon, coffee in the morning, and then they got to work early and they were able to play tennis. I was staying at the Y and, you know, quite close to the tennis courts. Anyway, we had to get into social welfare work, public welfare. We had to take an oral exam and written exam, and you know, the written wasn't difficult at all, and I'd done very well. Anyway, the oral exam, I still recollect those three women, you know, sitting around that table. And the first question they asked me was, what did you do, Miss Snyder? We were always called by our surnames. If you were accosted in Vancouver by a man begging you for money. And I said, well, if it were at Christmas time, and I really felt he needed some money, I would give him a quarter. And that probably was all I would be able to afford. And I could just see, I had said the wrong thing, I could just see that was wrong. But anyway, I blocked out the other questions. I answered those all right, and so I got into the field of social welfare.
Do you remember who it was that did the interview?
I think Miss Elizabeth King, and you know, and there was the head of the psychiatric social work division, a very nice person. I liked her, but I can't recall her name,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't remember the third person. Isn't it funny? It's something I blocked out.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I want to say I had learned that this is what I was to do if I was accosted by a man. So when I was over here in Victoria doing my fieldwork in the family agency, we had to go back after the first year in social work to do field work. Or rather, to do to do theory after we had done our 2 months field work over here in June and May. We had to do July and August. We had to go back to social work before we got our diploma. And the family agency was way up on Pandora, and the Y was downtown, practically where it is now. And I used to go home at lunch. You know, I was able to sprint home and get lunch and get back. And I used to go through a little cemetery over here by the cathedral. And one day at noon, a person who was certainly down and out asked me if I had money for a cup of coffee. And I said, well, you know, there is a soup kitchen. I don't think that was the name then, but it's what, you know, probably was called a soup kitchen. I said, it's down by the city hall. And I said, they give coffee, you know, any time during the day, and you would be able to get coffee there. Because this is what the supervisor had said, this is what I should have done, direct the man to a social agency. So he looked very downcast at this reception. But anyway, I went on. And the second day, when I was coming through, the same man accosted me. And I gave him 10 cents for a cup of coffee.
Did you tell your supervisor that you had done that?
Well, of course, no, I didn't, because they were just the people who were screening us out for the public welfare field. It was quite something to get into public welfare. And we had Dr. Cassidy, you know, who was head of the School of Social Work in Toronto, teaches public welfare. And we also had George Davidson, who was the head of the Canadian Welfare Council for some time.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went to the United Nations in some social work or social welfare capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, and actually, when I think too of the people who were our instructors in the School of Social Work, they were women, except for these two men. Well, Dr. The director of the School of Social Work. I'd forgotten his name for the moment. But anyway, we admired them very much. We admired them as persons first. And we thought, if we, you know, can reach to their heights, you know, we may be helpful, you know,
mm-hmm.
to our families and people with whom we're going to work. You know, we just continually, I think all of us admire them very much.
Mm-hmm.
Now for the men, Dr. Cassidy and Dr. Davidson, I think we admired them for their knowledge, not so much for their personalities, but and it's funny, I can't remember the director of the school. He's still living.
I wonder if it was
Dr.
Dr.
To start with T, Dr. Toppy.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. You know, I liked him, but I didn't have the same warm feeling toward him as I did, or the same admiration for him as I did for Davidson and Cassidy and for our lady, you know,
Mm-hmm.
instructors.
Are there classmates of yours at the time that particularly stand out?
Yes, May Titterding was one of my warm associates. She is dead. She became a medical social worker, worked for quite some time in the Vancouver General, and also well, there were several. Oh, yes, Ruby McKay, you know, who's our superintendent of child welfare for many years here in British Columbia. Who's a very old friend of Glen Lundy's, and who now is quite ill. But Ruby was a VON nurse in Vancouver, and she was still working as a VON nurse and taking classes part-time. And she had an old Ford car, and my friend and I lived quite some distance from the university. And Ruby would pick us up, and sometimes we had night classes or group sessions, and Ruby would take us. And I can remember Ruby and I wondering what Miss McFedrin, who taught us casework, was talking about. And I got out in the field, believe it or not knowing what casework was. And Ruby said, Bessie, I haven't any idea either. I felt better if Ruby didn't know what casework was. I didn't either. And, you know, those the two persons now that stand out most for me. We only had one man in the class, but he didn't continue. And yet, Miss McFedrin, I can remember saying in one of our sessions, you know, I've forgotten his name, he understands what this is all about, you know, pointing out to us women in the class, you know, why don't you smarten up, sort of thing. But we did admire Miss McFedrin even so. But she was not able to even give case examples. Well, at least I could accept the fact that I didn't understand. But I was so relieved once when, you know, Ruby McKay and I were talking that she too said, Bessie, what is she doing? But Laura Holland, have you heard of Laura Holland? Dr. Laura Holland? We got a doctorate because for contribution to social work in British Columbia, and particularly in public welfare. She was one that we admired very much, and you know, had a very warm, outgoing personality. And I remember the one thing that I remember that is stuck in my mind all these years. She was describing a particular family case situation. I can't remember the details, but I can remember her saying, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." You know, and that helped me certainly to understand what tolerance was really, and you know, incidents of that nature that stand out, you know, that stay with you all years.
You did, yeah. Did you do another field placement besides the one that you had done here in Victoria?
Not during the you know, the first years, no, but we had 2 months. Then we went back 2 more months of theory. Then they placed us in the field. And at that point, you were the lone worker in the field. You had I had 2 days with Miss Mary King, who became superintendent of child welfare following Ruby McKay. And you know the nature of our caseload at that point? That we were doing a generalized service, of which we pioneered in British Columbia, and of which I still am very proud. We had, I think about a third of our caseload would be mothers on mother's allowance. And then about 10% of our load, I think, would be the single people on relief. They got $900 a month. Then the next classification were those that were unemployable, as we would call them now. They were called destitute, poor, and sick. And so probably 20 or we'd have more DP&S than we would have mother's allowance. I'm not sure that my percentages are going to add up to 100. But anyway, the destitute, poor, and sick people got $20 a month. That's per person.
Mhm.
But $20 went further in those days than $9.
Mhm.
Yeah. And $35 for a mother and one child, and each child I believe got $7.50 up to I believe a maximum $5. But to be on mother's allowance, you had to have 3 years residence in the province. You had to be a British citizen. You had to produce your marriage certificate or your divorce papers. You were divorced. A single mother, an unmarried single mother, that is, would not be eligible for mother's allowance, but she probably would be eligible if she was unable to work for DPNS.
Mhm.
And then we did all the families where the breadwinner or the main person in the family was TB, tuberculosis, was still rampant then. And we, though we were not nurses, had to go certain intervals and pick up the sputum cups and get them back to head office here in, I believe those went to Vancouver because we had a tubercular sanatorium in conjunction with Vancouver General then. And then we did all the social work histories for Provincial Mental Hospital. And we would have to go and interview the family of the patient and get the social history. Then we had a good number of unmarried parents, and we visited them and helped them make the decision about whether or not they would keep their baby or have the baby placed for adoption. And then in Salmon Arm, I had a good number of children in foster homes. We would, and then we had also another category of juvenile delinquents, because we would have to make the arrangements if the boys or girls, principally they were boys, who would be coming down to the boys' industrial school in Vancouver. And I can remember wondering why the teachers didn't refer me. They're delinquent children. I went out feeling that, I was going to cure all the ills of the community. There would not be any more social work problems. And I made it a point to meet all the teachers, meet the principals. And of course, we had to meet the policeman. And we made it a point to meet community people. We went and saw the municipal clerk or the lead, the municipality, or the city. We visited ministers, regardless of denomination, because we felt they were going to be very helpful, resource people. And we wanted them to know that a social worker had arrived in their community.
Right.
And, we were there to make life really better.
I'm interested in, given the description that you've made of the services that you were providing, who was it that you were working for again?
The Department of Public Welfare. And that, it had a different name then, but we, at that time, the Department of Public Health, Public Welfare and Health were one department.
Mm-hmm.
And the minister was Dr. Robert Weir. And it so happened that when my friend and I were going to School of Social Work at UBC, we lived with his sister, Miss Elizabeth Weir, who was a Saskatoon person. All the Weirs were very fine academicians. I can't say that. How do you say it?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, Robert Weir was Minister of Education, Minister of Social Welfare here for a while. His brothers were deans of law, and the registrar at Saskatchewan University was another brother of the Weirs. And this Elizabeth Weir, after 60, took her master's at UBC. So Robert Weir was so on social work, and I remember reading one of his papers when I got into research in the department, saying we spent one half of 1%, half a percent on social research, it would be helpful. Very, very progressive.
So after you had finished at school of social work, then that was your first job, was working for the Department of Public Welfare as a.
Yes, and inter-seminar into the Okanagan.
Oh, you were in the Okanagan.
Yes, seminar.
Oh, I see.
That's the top town. It's the north end of the Okanagan Valley. Where did you think?
You had said Salmon Arm, but I'm so unfamiliar with BC geography that I didn't know where it was.
Yes. Well, it was a beautiful, beautiful valley. Beautiful place. But I had a large territory. I had to go to Revelstoke and down into the southern part of Revelstoke, down into the south of Revelstoke, into the Lake Country, Trout Lake, and so on. Then I had to go about 60 miles west of the city of Kamloops, Then similarly south to the city of Vernon, but not into the city of Vernon, but there were several towns in between. Then I had to go into the Lake Country north of Shuswap Lake, where there were no, probably post offices, but no villages. And I had a caseload of over 300, between 300 and 400. That was before we got added to our generalized caseload the old age assistance program. But we tried to visit our mothers and fathers' families at least once a month, and our mothers and unmarried mothers. Initially, we would visit them if we could at least once a week. Now the people in our foster home children, depending on the situation, we would visit them if we could at least once a week. And the people are destitute, poor, and sick because we realized it was sort of a chronic situation. It would be fortunate for them if we could visit every 2 or 3 months. And the government agents and people were so helpful. They would tell you if the person on relief at $9 a month, had been able to get a job. They would let you know. The cooperation of the community was what carried the day for us.
How did you get around that huge territory?
That's another story. I had to have a medical before I could get into this Department of Social Welfare. And I said to the doctor, I had 4 colds a year. Well, that's too many. So in the clinic, they called in a couple doctors, and I really had a sore throat, but they said I had to have my tonsils out. And this one doctor, Dr. McKechnie, who was going to be the surgeon, he said, we'll take them out locally. And I said, well, I'll not be able to pay you because I have to buy a car. And I had to borrow $100 to buy the car. The car only cost $1,000, but I got a brand new Valiant Coupe. No, Plymouth Coupe. Well, Valiant and Plymouth is similar. But we were going to get 10 cents mileage. And my predecessor said, you'll have about 10,000 miles, to cover your area in 1 year. So it worked out well. And I was able to send, as I recall it, $35 down towards payment of my car. And I think $5 a month until I got the $35 paid for my tonsillectomy.
Which is one of the requirements of going to work for the Department.
You just could not get in to social work. If this examining doctor, and they had only this one doctor, didn't have any choice. I think there were 4 of us who were getting into the social welfare program.
Were you the only social worker in that area? Salmon Arm, Revelstoke?
Yes, I had a secretary, and you could have your secretary for as long as you needed her. And she had been the secretary of Mary King, my predecessor. So she had lived in the community, she knew the family, she knew how to get there. Occasionally I would take her with me if we were going to be a very difficult route and I would get lost. And my one concern as a field worker, and I think the major concern then, was this Residence and Responsibility Act.
What was that?
That was if a person had not resided 1 year in the local area, then that person was not eligible for relief or DP&S. I don't think that applied for mother's allowances. And therefore, you had to contact the local area in which he had acquired 1 year's residence and advise them that this man would have to be returned in order to be in receipt of any assistance. And that worried us tremendously because in the Okanagan then, there were not too many organized districts. So that when I went out, I expected to see on every 2 or 3 miles of fence posts, whether this was organized or unorganized territory. Because if it were organized territory, then it was for certain that this person was going to have to be returned to the municipality from which he had come.
Mm-hmm.
If it were unorganized territory, that residence and responsibility didn't apply. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
And a similar situation attains today by reason of the fact McCarthy, the head of the Department of Human Resources, said last night they were going to ship these young men back to the area in which they come.
Mm-hmm. And that's against the federal law under
Right.
which social assistance is paid.
And we took so long to get rid of the Residence and Responsibility Act.
Mm-hmm.
So it just, the House of the Clock are just turned.
Again. So that was the situation in the Okanagan.
It was
1938.
similar through the whole province. And Dr.
1938,
Cassidy
39.
and George Davison worked very hard, to effect changes to
Mhm.
that legislation.
What was his position at that time?
Dr. Cassidy,
Cassidy and Davidson both.
Well, the Honorable Mr. Weir had these 2 men come in to help him establish a sound program in public welfare in British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certain that we would not have had that generalized service. And I think our Mother's Allowance gave, at that point in time, 37, 38, more liberal allowance than any of the other provinces. Now, I mean, certainly we were more progressive than Alberta, Saskatchewan, and I think that would improve Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't be faster. Dr. Cassidy went from here to the School of Social Work in Toronto.
Mm-hmm. Sometime during those years, Charlotte Whitten was in British Columbia examining child welfare services. I think that was about 1927. And she was back again sometime in the mid-30s looking at relief and the administration of the mother's, I think it was called the Mother's Pension.
Well, my Mother's Allowance.
Mother's Allowance. Did you have any awareness of that?
Well, I met Charlotte, and I was she came to Salmon Arm, and our social workers and my teacher friends and so on. Any that I felt would be interested in meeting Charlotte Whitten, we had a luncheon for her at our hotel in Salmon Arm, and she did her, as I understand it, most of her research in Alberta because of the rather difficult situation there with respect to the whole program of social work.
What did you think about Miss Whitten when you met her?
Well, I liked her very, very much. She very forthright, and she said, "Don't worry about whether or not you get to church. You're dead tired at the end of the week. You know, just have a good rest. Do your laundry and so on. You know, see, very
Did someone be giving you a hard time about not going to church?
well. Certainly, the family with whom I boarded expected me, you know, to go to church each Sunday, and you know, I sort of didn't feel that I should. I don't know whether I don't know whether I broached the subject, or Cheryl Clinton talked generally about how hard she knew we social workers were working.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did her visit have an impact on the way you did your work in that area?
Other than I thought the social that Charlotte Whitten understood that, you know, what a big job we have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she didn't have to say too many things to help me understand, but she realized that, you know, I was doing the best I could, and I had a big job to do.
Yeah. Where were you when the war broke out?
Well, I was in San Leonard.
How did the war affect your work and what you were doing?
Well, it didn't affect me immediately. It didn't affect me in Salmon Arm because I was asked to come into the family agency, family service agency in Vancouver, head of which was Miss McFedrin. And I'm sure Miss McFedrin had realized I didn't understand what casework was. She wouldn't have invited me into her agency and made me district secretary of North Vancouver and West Vancouver. But working with me, fellow workers, Charlotte Cornwall, and Charlotte Emery then. And Charlotte Emery was one of the honor students from the School of Social Work of Toronto. And Charlotte knew a lot more about social work than I did, but because I was the senior person, I was in charge. But we had a very happy time in North Vancouver and West Vancouver. And I stayed 2 years with Miss McFedrin. And then there was an opportunity for social workers to go overseas to help the social work situation in Great Britain. And I volunteered for that. But only 7 were accepted, and I wasn't accepted. But I'd already resigned from the family agency. And in fact, I thought I was really more on loan to the family agency. And I really didn't enjoy my work in North Vancouver and West Vancouver, as well as I enjoyed the field work, and I wanted to get back into the field, into public welfare.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, it was just a matter of saying, well, yes, Bessie, you can certainly, you know, have a job back in the welfare field service. So they sent me up to Prince Rupert during the war, and that was a very difficult situation by reason of the fact I was the only social worker that the chap preceding me had resigned to join the army, so there'd been nobody in the office for 3 or 4 months. And it was difficult first to get a place to live, because about 20,000 American soldiers came into Prince Rupert, and then the Canadian Army came in as well, and the Navy was there. Prince Rupert was in a very vulnerable spot because they expected the Japanese to attack any time, and the harbor was mined. The boats, we went on the Union steamships from Vancouver to Prince Rupert, and they were always blacked out. And we often had alarms when they asked citizens in town to fill their bathtubs because, you know, they might be short of water and so on. And my territory extended out of Prince Rupert about 400 miles east. I had to go on the CNR rail line. Though eventually I did get a car in town in Prince Rupert, And I did get a car in Smithers, which would be 300 miles east of Prince Rupert. And I'd leave the car there and pick it up and then do the hundreds of miles territory roundabout. And then I had it as well with Queen Charlotte's. And then added to our caseload, which I described, we had these inquiries on soldiers' families, and I forget. I think they're called dependents, DBTs. What the? I forgot. Anyway, inquiries about dependents of soldiers. And they were very, very detailed forms, about 4 pages, and questions in each page. You had to go into every item of the family's situation before they could get extra money to supplement their husband's allowance. And in a sense, the federal government said those had priority. You know, that we had to get those billed promptly and get them back, because soldiers' families had priority effect. I was there 3 years, so throughout the rest of the war, and then came back to head office in Victoria, as at that time they wanted to give some of us workers in the field in-service training to be supervisors. At that point, they were going to place supervisors directly in the field offices. And that was a very big step forward. And so I became one of those supervisors. And I had for my supervisor here, Lila Mess, a very much loved supervisor. And I owe her a great deal. So then we had university lectures too for a couple of months from the School of Social Work to round off our training as supervisors. Then we were placed as supervisors in the field. Well, actually, they had 2 levels of supervisors. You were a district supervisor, a regional supervisor, and I was sent as a regional supervisor to the Kootenay area. You know where the Kootenay area is? Do you? Yeah? And I had all that Kootenay area from the Alberta border to Grand Forks area. All that area. But there were, I suppose, a half a dozen district offices, and there was a supervisor in each district office, probably 3 or 4 workers. So you see how we've grown in that period of time.
And then
I was a district supervisor, so I would visit each district office at least once a month. And then we had government cars. And in addition to the regional supervisor, there was a regional administrator. The administrator looked after the placement of staff, establishment of offices, financial matters, and I assisted the supervisors.
I just wanted to ask you a question about the war. Was the internment of the Japanese, did that have any effect on you and what you were doing?
It did have an effect on me, because I saw the Japanese families, women and children, behind barbed wire in the exhibition grounds in Vancouver. And I shall never forget that. Some of the families, when they were dispersed throughout the province, were sent into the Kootenay area, up into New Denver. But that was subsequent to my leaving the Kootenay area as supervisor. So I really, and anyway, probably there were a few when I was there. The worker, there wasn't a supervisor in the New Denver office, because it was a small office, but the worker, I would talk with him, but I can't remember him talking about the Japanese families. Quite a few of them were tubercular,
Mm-hmm.
and they had these small huts. I remember that too now, but I didn't have any really direct contact, and the public health nurses then were separate from our social work department. They were principally doing all the health work.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that those families were receiving financial assistance through the federal department, not through the provincial department.
Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't
I
have,
can't be definite about that.
you wouldn't have of necessity had contact then with the Japanese Canadians through your
No,
work.
but I read the story of the Japanese evacuation written by that girl Joy. I can't remember her name. Have you read it?
Kagawa, yes. Obasan.
Yes. It's. I'm so pleased now that they're going to give compensation to some of those Japanese families.
Mm-hmm.
And did you? Were you listening to TV last night?
No.
Where one of the Japanese people who was receiving some compensation, I think his fishing boat was confiscated and so on, he said he still was proud to live in Canada and be a Canadian.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Maybe that'd be a good place to take a break. Should we stop for a minute?
I'd love that. I thought.
We're resuming our conversation today with Miss Bessie Snyder. Miss Snyder, we've been talking about your work at the Department of Public Welfare during the Second World War, and we were just discussing the situation of Japanese Canadians. When you had become, was it regional supervisor?
Yes.
And what did you do after that job? Where did you go then?
Well, that's when then I came into head office again to be posted to the field. No, I think you're not. I'm not on tape now, am I? Oh, shut it off for a moment. I should have looked. I should have looked at it.
Well,
Let me see.
Let me ask the question another way then. When did you get into the field of research?
In 1953.
So that was considerably, well, not considerably later, sometime later.
Yes. Well, I then was in the field after I came down from during the war. I was in Rupert. Came down to be regional supervisor for Kootenays, and came in to into head office, and then for a time I was supervising the north end of Vancouver Island, Courtenay and Alberni.
Mm-hmm.
Then in '53 I came in to into the research department. Elizabeth Harvey had been the research consultant, and when her job became vacant, I applied and got it. So that I remained in social research as a research consultant. And that's a misnomer, because actually I was the research department for a while until I finally got an assistant. From then until I retired in December 1967.
How did you happen to get interested in research?
Well, I felt I had had a very rich experience in the field. For a while in Vancouver, I supervised university students in training, and I've forgotten to mention that. That would be in the interval following being regional supervisor of the Kootenay area. I think I supervised, I supervised university students for approximately 2 years. Then I wanted field experience, because I told you coming in here that I was going to work someday in Victoria and retire here. So I watched, vacancies and so on. So when I got to be, I got the opportunity to go as district supervisor to Courtney, that was the north end of the island. But, well, that's getting close. And I'd already bought property out along the Straits of Juan de Fuca, about 9 acres. And, I wanted to get close. And the deputy minister knew that.
Mm-hmm.
Knew that was my object. He was deputy before Mr. Lundy, Mr. Griffith.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, "Well, Bessie, you get there, by degrees." And so when you see that, I wasn't really motivated by my social work when I wanted to, get into research, but that was getting into administration, and I wanted the experience,
Mm-hmm.
and I enjoyed that thoroughly.
Mm-hmm. How had you had training in research?
No. Special training. I had got some credits towards my master's because when I was working in Vancouver, I was taking classes all the time. You see, but I never did.
Mm-hmm.
Take time off long enough to write a thesis.
Mm-hmm. So how did you start that job then? What were your thoughts as you walked in the door and as you began work in a new area?
Well, I worked in collating our annual reports, editing our annual reports that came in from all the regions and district offices. That was one of the jobs. One of the first jobs that I worked with the office consultant who with me were compiling a manual of instructions for our field staff. And then I was secretary, in a sense, and it was a difficult job, to administration. Every month they called in all the head administrators of regions and supervisors. They asked supervisors and administrators. I think they had done away with regional supervisors at that time and administrators because there was conflict. There was bound to be. It didn't work out well in the Kootenays with my regional administrator and myself being regional supervisor. The roles were not too clearly defined. So then I said, well, I want to do some social research. So I had to dream up my own projects, pretty much. And one thing that I did that I think really was helpful was a time study of our field staff, supervisory staff. It took quite some time. I did some financial studies too for child welfare. But I can't say from my own point of view that I got much satisfaction. That is, that I got a great deal of satisfaction in the pieces of work that I was doing, other than what I did in that time study, because I worked well with the senior people in the health department. They had done time studies, and I did, quite a lot of study, and then, I was able to use our computer section. We hadn't had that before. Any other research I had to do, with an ordinary calculator and so on. And I worked too closely with one of the men in the department controller's office.
Mm-hmm.
The editing of the annual reports was just to be certain, that we told related story about our department, and then finding it when it got to the minister, some of the negative things that we said were deleted. We always had to present a very positive picture then, as I'm sure now, because for some time after I retired, I got the annual reports, and then I felt, worth reading.
Mm-hmm. Were there other people in the social welfare field at that time who were doing social research in British Columbia and in Vancouver and Victoria?
Not in our department. Say for the last 2 years, 2 or it could be 3 years, I had an assistant, Art Whippen, a very fine man who had been a district supervisor. Art had his master's in social work, and we enjoyed our time together very much.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted then to start a history of social work, and we had all these records way up in the top of the Parliament buildings. And I would say to our director of our department, Jim, we've got to, retrieve some of that material, and we've got to start, mimeographing it, and doing something with it. It's going to go out to the dump, these days, but you just couldn't get departmental heads interested in that. They were interested, but they had too many other things out that they felt had priority.
Mm-hmm.
And from my point of view, we were losing a lot of valuable material.
Mm-hmm. During the
And
time,
I went up there many times. It was a difficult place to get up to, very cold and musty and dusty and so on. And just felt even we could sort out, retrieve some of the material, get it into the archives.
mm-hmm.
That would have been a contribution I would have liked to have made and couldn't do.
Mm-hmm. During the time that you were the director of research, did you do work on social policy issues? I'm hearing you say that there was a lot of research into administrative issues.
As the secretary of these administrative meetings that last 3 and 4 days, one when I was taking it down in longhand, but condensing it and then bringing it back to administration, and you were very much part of policy decision, because you were one of the senior people in administration. But again, there's not much focus on research really, and I was able to get to several conferences in Ottawa. One thing that was interesting as I was there, I was a member of the Federal Provincial Committee on Indians, and I was the chief representative of our department, and Shirley Arnold, who was the head social worker for the Federal Affairs Department of Indians, was the co-chairman. And we had one of our district supervisors on that committee. We had a couple Indian agents on that committee. That was the committee. We met once a month, and it took us 10 years to get a similar amount of social assistance to Indian families as to non-Indians. We went all over the province. We talked to municipal people and so on and so on. We talked to our own regional administrators. And finally we convinced them that Indian people were people, Indian children were like our children, and they could not subsist on the amount of Indian relief.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure Shirley Arnold, who's still living, a very big friend of mine, would conceive, but that was the one thing we did. And that the only thing probably we did. After 10 years of meeting federal representatives and provincial representatives to get equality of assistance.
Takes a long time to get changes.
I'm sure that the committee has long since been disbanded. And too, I was on the CNIB as representative of our department. But I had been on that board for 10 years. I said, that's not enough to be on any board. I'm not, continuing. But did you ever know of Laurie Mortimer, who was the director? She herself was blind, very, very fine person. She got her master's here while she was being director of the CNIB here. And some of her friends, including me, we used to read every Sunday night to Gloria social work texts. And then she went to travel and got her master's. Very pleased.
During the time that you were director of research, what kinds of pressures were upon you?
Not anything compared to the field. You worked your regular hours, and I was one that always liked getting to the office early. I'd be off in my office, around 8 o'clock. But we stopped at 5 o'clock. I sometimes took them home, but not like I did when I was in the field, either as a worker or supervisor, a regional supervisor. There was certain times, when there were night meetings and so on, but they were infrequent by comparison to what you would have out in the field.
During part of the time that you were in that position, British Columbia experienced some severe financial problems, economic constraints and cutbacks in social welfare. And I read that at one point in time in the late 50s or early 60s, social workers all over the province were resigning in protest of government policy and social assistance.
Not to the same extent. We were only cut back, as I recall, 6%, of staff. And, I think of another project, which I did do, which I was interested in, when that would be in the 60s, and I can't remember exactly when there was a great number of unemployed. You can check that. And no one volunteered to go up to our Prince Rupert office to do some interviews then. And I said, well, I'm in senior administration, I'm in research. I would like to go up and do the interviews and do the research in the Region 5, as that was called then. Go to our Prince Rupert office, go to Terrace, Smithers, go up to Dawson City, or Dawson Creek, and to Fort St. James and so on, which I did. And I did some of the actual interviewing of these men who were not again to British Columbia because we were the Mecca. I shall never forget one day I was in the Prince Rupert office, and this very rough-looking man came in. I got the interviewees through the district supervisor, and as I was interviewing this man, they came in with a cup of coffee for me. And I looked at that man and I said, would you like this coffee? And he was just so hungry and so thirsty, he just gulped down the coffee. Then he told me that he spent some time in jail. And but he was cooperative during the interview. And I had a room during that week that I was in Rupert, in the old Prince Rupert Hotel, which looked over 2nd Street. And I had worked in Rupert, and it was one of the poor streets then, and it was still very poor. And I was doing this survey in February, which is a very poor month to be in Rupert. In Rupert, it rains as much in the summertime as it does here in Vancouver and Bremerton in the winter. And my window of my room looked down on the street, and I saw the same man that I had interviewed, say, on the Friday, walking up and down that street. You know, he had nowhere to go, and I quite appreciate how he got hungry enough that he'd have to walk to get some food, and I don't know where he was sleeping or what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
and I did an interesting sort of little piece of research on my own. I was able to get an Indian family on one of the islands down the Skeena River on Mother's Allowance. And I had to fight very hard with our supervisors who received our reports at head office to get this Indian mother, and she had 3 or 4 children, on the Mother's Allowance rather than on the social assistance. So you got more on Mother's Allowance for a while. And I was so pleased that I got this mother. And the reason I remember this family so well, when I would visit her, and I would have to go with the Indian agent on their boat to visit this family, I had said to the mother, we do have some of our mother's allowances to help them manage their allowance, keep a record of what it costs, for them to buy certain things. And I had explained to our mothers when I was asking them this, I did, done this early in the field, how it would be helpful if I had this information so that I could get it back to our office to get the allowance raised. So I had said to this mother, in the presence of her teenage boy, who would be about 12, not more, we have a column for miscellaneous. You can't remember everything. Anything that you do have to spend money on, you put it in miscellaneous. So the little boy said to me, "How do you spell miscellaneous?" And I spelled it out for him. And it was such a tidy, lovely home. They had to have their wood because it rained so much there inside their house. They only had 1 bedroom in this one large room. And her husband had been a fisherman and had been drowned. Well, when I came back the next time, they had this beautifully outlined in this scribbler, and the boy had done it all. He was so pleased about this. So I went to Rupert in the 60s. You see, I'd been there in the 40s, during the war. I thought, I am going to look up that McLeod family and see what happened to that young boy. Did he become, a successful fisherman? And sure enough, he had. And he had been, his family, had been doing well. And then, just by coincidence, one of the interviewers was a non-Indian who came in. But in the course of a conversation, he told me that he was had married this Indian woman, a widow woman, a Mrs. McLeod. And it just so happened, before he'd come in, you see, I had been reading this old record, closed record. So I didn't mention that. But, it was common, obviously, the relationship. It was a very happy relationship. And I was so pleased that there, Mrs. McLeod, was living in Rupert and was having, again, a rather happy life in her old years. Mm-hmm. But I was so pleased, to learn that there, that young boy who was so interested in helping his mother, so fine. And of course, I heard in the course of time about my Mrs. McLeod family down the Skeena River, how she was occasionally in the beer parlor, And I thought, well, so what? Mm-hmm. That was one of the things I didn't record in my record down to head office.
Mm-hmm. She would be looked down upon for that.
Well, at that time, they would have felt that she was spending her money foolishly. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't have appreciated a glass of beer in the miscellaneous column sort of thing. Though they never ever saw, these books that the others were keeping.
No.
So I was sending down reports telling them how inadequate their lots were.
Also, during the time that you were Director of Research, the Canada Assistance Plan came into effect. Were you at all involved or affected by the negotiations for that cost-sharing plan?
No, the Canada Assistance Plan didn't come in. I retired in '67. It was in, I think it would be in '65, would it not?
Yeah.
But I wasn't out in the field then, you see, and I don't know whether they deducted from the amount of social assistance. By then, Mother's Allowance was defunct because our social assistance program was operating then, and we had one of the best social assistance acts in Canada. In fact, it was reported so in one of the United Nations reports, and no residence requirements, and no scrutiny of the bank accounts or of going to employers to get statements, and at that time too, the residence and responsibility act was no longer operating, and the assistance was on the basis of need. But mind you, the amounts of assistance were inadequate, and I worked in conjunction with the agency United Way. I knew the researchers there, and they were doing studies in the city of Vancouver to show how inadequate the allowances were.
Yes.
And at one point in some of the research that I did, it's coming back now, we did a study of the cost of living in 90 centres throughout British Columbia, and we found that the city of North Vancouver had one of the lowest cost of living rates, and the city of Vernon in the Okanagan was the second lowest. Victoria was high, and but those are two things that I remember very distinctly. North Vancouver had the lowest cost of living, which was surprising to me because I had worked there as district supervisor during the first part of the war in the family agency. And but I wasn't surprised that Vernon City and the Okanagan, which is sort of the center of the Okanagan, had one of the lowest costs of living.
Maybe we can stop for just a second.
During the war. And he was just, he hadn't reached his 16th birthday because we had to have a Canadian registration of all citizens during the war. And he wasn't an adult. It was of all adult citizens. And that was the first time the university found that he wasn't yet 16. Well, he wasn't registered, and that was why.
You were mentioning when we stopped there that you were having some conversations with the people at the social planning department in the United Way. Do you have a recollection of who you were dealing with then?
It was Dr. such and such and two women, and we went to a conference up in the Lake Country north of Toronto, and I can't recall his name. He was a very nice person, and the two young women that worked with him, and they were with the research department of United Way. And the whole conference was on research. on the family family. I even can't remember the focus of that. Isn't that beautiful?
Oh wow.
Anyways, I was representing
Yeah.
our department. We had to at least 3 or 4 days up in it's the famous.
Must have been the Geneva Park. Geneva Park is where they often held.
Which?
Geneva Park is where they often held social planning conferences in those days. Lake
No.
Peach.
Well, my nephew has a cottage up in Georgian Bay, but it's the series of lakes to the east of Georgian Bay. It's about I'd say about 100 miles north of Toronto. Oh, it's a very famous lake area. I can't remember it. And one of the big lumber merchants who was interested in social research, and you got certain deductions from income tax.
Mm-hmm.
If they held such conferences, and representatives right across Canada came to that conference. It was on families on low income.
Mm-hmm.
That was generally the theme of the conference.
Mm-hmm.
But both these 3 people from Vancouver were there, and are you going to see Peggy Crowley?
I'm not sure. I don't know whether she
was very high administrative head of the Department of Public Welfare of the Vancouver City.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And very brilliant person.
Mm-hmm.
And I should think, and Peg Gurley would remember. I'm sure she will tell you about that conference.
Well, if I'm interviewing her, I'll be sure to ask. Over the years, did you have much to do with the Association of Social Workers?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was president briefly, and I always was a member of the social work of the association, and was very anxious that we become organized as a society. I was also, I felt our in-service training class that we had for some time wasn't adequate, really, and critical of that. I felt, that certainly it was helpful, and I used to go over and give one session. But I felt, I felt that I myself had been inadequately trained, and that we should, have that if all possible, our social workers have the opportunity to have some university training.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think one of the members of the administration that felt strongly about that, and I voiced my opinion about that in our administrative meetings.
Mm-hmm. What kind of response?
I remember, I thought, well, this is Bessie again. But I remember once we were having a meeting with our new minister. It was I don't know whether I should. This is going to enter into the political field. Does it matter?
No, that's fine.
Well, anyway, the social credit people were in power. This was certainly before the NDPs had got in, and they were only in for a short while. And we had a new minister, and we had a new deputy. And our new deputy, whom I liked, but who had been in the Department of Controller's office, who did not have experience in social work, but who had himself, as a young man, because I think he lost his father early and had to work very hard, and was a very talented, clever man, had become, a departmental controller, which is something. And then he became the head of our department of social work as deputy minister. Well, he was new to the job, and we had this new minister, and we had such heavy caseloads, and they asked me, as research consultant, to do a study on what I thought would be adequate for the number of extra social workers we needed. At the point, you see, where they were certain that this, again, restraint that the social credit people were going to, practice. They were going to do it early. This is not new. So after the other people in the administration had said their piece, I had mine all prepared, and so I gave it. And I could just see all their faces just, did she have the nerve to do this? So after the meeting was over, the new minister seemed to be the least concerned of all. I noticed that. But they said, Bessie, we're not probably going to get one person after you gave that presentation. I said, well, you asked me to prepare what that I thought would be adequate, and I had the statistics and they spoke for themselves, didn't they? And that minister was he was pleased that I had said what I had said. Mm-hmm. And, we became friends as, I was never going to a conference with him on Indian affairs. Mm-hmm. And he was Mr. Black, and Black. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he was thankful that someone had spoken up. Mm-hmm. Now, he didn't rectify the situation much, but it didn't really weaken our position. I think it strengthened it, and I think he was able to listen more open-mindedly. And I remember coming into my office shortly after, and he said, gee, gods, what an office you've got. Because at that point, I was up in sort of the eaves of the building. Mm-hmm. And then there, I got one of the best offices with a carpet and so on.
Yes.
Sure. Sort of. But I think, it's important to, if you feel you have facts, to say them. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly, that proved to me that it doesn't, it actually, it may seem you're going to rock the boat even, So, and it might not have worked out well, mm-hmm. because I think it worked out to the advantage of the whole department. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Black knew where I stood, and I knew he stood, and I know he really felt that had been helpful to him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if I could move to a couple of more general questions. Mm-hmm. Over the years that you were in the field of social work, from 1937 to 1953, and then on into director of research.
Oh, I beg your pardon. 66.
No, that's okay. What do you recollect as the most significant changes that you saw?
I'm not quite hearing you.
Sorry. Over those years, during your career as a social worker, what do you think, in your opinion, what were the most significant changes that happened that affected social welfare?
Insofar as our own department was concerned, I feel having direct supervision to social workers in the field was very effective. I have to come back to the fact that I think we have one of the finest pieces of social legislation in our Social Assistance Act, which had no residence qualification and no citizenship qualification. That is why, in effect, that we could say this applies to the Indian people. And then well, I can't. I think generally we got our caseloads smaller, and probably it was a positive move too when they said some of the staff will become social workers who will administer the old age assistance program. And then caseloads, some workers had caseloads of 1,000 or more. Now you know, there are only 365 days in a year. There are probably 200 working days because we, social workers, became unionized. And how often then do you visit, you say, 1,000 old age assistance clients?
Not too often.
But it did mean then that caseloads of other workers were in a range probably, if some workers are caring for foster children, they might have 40, and it might have gone up to 100, 200. I haven't, of course, reviewed those figures for a long, long time, and I'm just, just really getting a very weak guesstimate.
But the unionization of social workers was certainly a major change that occurred during the time.
I didn't hear that.
The unionization of social workers was certainly a major change. That
Oh yes, it was. Yes, and I say now I have great sympathy for people who are walking the picket line. And I was just talking to a friend of mine last evening who said, "Bessie, isn't that dreadful? That situation over there at BC Place, the cook-off and building this condominium." And I said, "Look, Vera," I said, "the man on the picket line is very visible, isn't he? And we can all point our finger at him." I said, "How about the people who are unionized, as our doctors, our nurses, and lawyers, and all our corporate heads? They're not very visible, are they? But aren't they doing similarly? Wanting higher and higher wages?" And of course, she stopped talking to me. Her husband is a retired civil engineer who had a very, very happy and very prosperous experience in installing hydro under the Montreal hit company in Montreal in various cities in South America. So, they haven't, though Vera was writing me then, she was my vice principal, but not the one that wanted me to get into social work. She was writing me letters from South America. "Bessie, they certainly could do with a social worker down here, And she's aware, that 2/3 of the world is hungry. But how, they can forget this. Only, remember it at certain times. I just can't understand.
Yeah.
But when people talk to me about the unions, I get very uptight because they were saying the same thing when children 9 years of age are down in the mines, weren't they? Beginning at the industrial age, that we just can't afford to give other than sweatshop wages. The same arguments were being used then as they are now. oh, this is off.
No?
Certainly off the record. But I did say, I don't know when you heard me, when you were in the kitchen kind of getting this glass of water, that how I feel about social work generally, my experience in social work, which I thoroughly enjoyed, was that I didn't give as much to my clients as the clients gave to me. And I believe that very much.
In what way did they give to you, Miss?
Because they had so much resilience. They were contending in situations that I or my friends could not, we could not have done as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they were doing it, I felt, with such a sense of this is the situation and we're meeting it. We're not going to cry and let our families down. And I felt that again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And, I felt, if we were only easing the situation a bit, that we were being helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But that really, it certainly gave me, a great feeling of, the individual strength of people and the whole fact that human beings have a really innate power that we're very, very well worthwhile and make one very optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Sounds inspiring in some cases.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I can remember Indian women who were being hounded in Prince Rupert where there was so much feeding. And, the public health doctors and nurses and so on. And I remember one Indian mother coming in and saying to me, and we were going to have to remove her children, it's not that you're the only person that cares. She felt that at least, and you got that again and again, which made you feel, that you were some value too.
Mm-hmm.
So, those are situations that I recall, and they're very pleasant memories.
I'm wondering if over the time if there are accomplishments or achievements of yours of which you're particularly proud, things that you're glad you did.
Are you? I'm not quite certain. I have a question. Are you asking me? Are there certain things that I think that I did that were helpful?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I really can't recall anything in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I can't. I can remember incidents like this. A young boy, child, I was transferring from one foster home to another, and we were having juice or something on the way, and I telling him about his foster parents and so on. And I had worked with him and the supervisor, and I was really working for the supervisor because he was coming from my Alberni office to my Courtney office. And the man in the shop saying, is Miss Snyder your aunt? The little bit boy said, no, she's my friend. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's just generally, the sort of a happy relationship, that one had, with one's clients.
Mm-hmm.
So, you had that in a sense with your students too. But, and I have, students visiting me again and again. And last year, I had a very happy experience just about this time. I say young, he'd be 57, Bob Strachan and his wife visited me. And, we were calling our old school days together. And then in the summertime, I had never met his wife. Actually, he married the school teacher who succeeded me as principal of the school. And we were sort of laughing about this. And Bob had been in the war and so on. And I didn't know that he had had severe injury and that he was not too well. when he visited me, because he didn't mention it, and he looked well. And his wife telephoned me, I think it was in July. She said, "I'm sorry to say that Bob died." But she said, "I do want us, to keep up our association." So you see, I had happy experiences, with my youngsters, older students as well as my younger students. So I had that, I enjoyed my teaching, but there was something about social work that I felt, well, as I've said, I think my clients helped me more, and I can't quite describe how that happened, or how it happened. I think my life was enriched by the fact that I went into social work. If I had stayed in school, you have to follow a curriculum and so on. You're hidebound by that. You have much more opportunity to be creative or to meet situations and use your own good common sense, because there's no curriculum to tell you what to do. And when your supervisors are remote, as ours were initially, you learn to be resilient. And you hope to, as you were supervisor, that you were able similarly to help your workers be self-reliant and responsible.
Right. Are there regrets that you have?
I think probably I regret the fact that when the Vic started, that I didn't take some night classes in research. I would like to have done a better job in the research aspect. When I was doing casework, I went to night classes, and we took advantage of any classes we could while we were in Vancouver. I guess I was becoming lazy when I got into head office here. I got interested in art, and I was taking art classes, and I think I would have done a better job in research if I had taken some night classes. I don't know whether they even gave them then. I took music appreciation and other things at night school, but I should have learned something about computer science and so on. And Art Rippon, who was with me, he did, and I think that's my main regret.
Miss Snyder, if you were starting out again, going out tomorrow to become a social worker, what would you try to do?
Well, may I ask? I trained social worker. I got, say, my BSW. And I'm in a job.
What needs to be done that social workers can do?
That's fine.
Sorry, my question wasn't very clear.
You mean in today's political situation? Well, as a matter of fact, I don't think I would be in social work. I would think it'd be just such an impossible job. Maybe I wouldn't feel that way if I were in my 30s. And I suppose you're presupposing that I am young and to contend with not only the job itself, but with the political climate. Are you?
You know with your experience what social workers can do and what they can't.
My heart just sort of beats for them. I think though the challenge would still be there, and that I would organize my work. That's the sort of thing I could do, and I would, I would carry on. I would seek out as many community sources as I possibly could. I know how tricky that is now by reason of the fact this histories I'm writing, where we are all volunteers in our auxiliary, and how the nurses' aides and so on are very, very afraid that we may be, doing something that deprives another one out of a job, and I think that's a real concern that they should have. And I still feel, as I listen to the government now saying you have to go to your community resources, and in our own little community in Saanich, you have so many people asking of church, UCWs, of all the volunteers, of Kinsmen and Rotary and so on, so many demands. And I have already, they're saying here in the city of Victoria, there are many bags short each day. I just think that are there any other sort of community resources to tap? And probably as a social worker, that would be one of the concerns that I would have. I would discuss it with my fellow social workers, and certainly would get to know, the community organizations and volunteers, and see what extra resources there would be to supplement the social allowances that are being given by the government.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would be spending a great deal more overtime, and I know that in the field, when I was in the field, at least a third of the time, the regular office hours, one spent an equivalent amount of that time in overtime. You'd start early in the morning, and you were coming back at 10, 11 o'clock at night. You never considered travel time as part of your working day. But I was healthy, and I was able to do that, and I enjoyed getting out. But I remember fellow workers in the government agent's office, because my office was a government agent, when I'd be going down to get mail on the train, so to get back to our head office, saying, "Why are you doing this?" There were no unions then, but they said, "Well, Bessie, you shouldn't be doing that."
Mm-hmm.
They were critical then. You are, that's beyond the call of duty sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you felt that it really wasn't hurting you, and it was benefiting your friends. And I wasn't doing it because I wanted to be a do-gooder, so to speak, in quotes. I felt it would be helpful, so I did it. But social workers now, if they're really, I think, doing their job, they must be doing, much more than that. I should think, but I really do not know. I've been out of it so often. And when I was teaching, similarly, I was at extracurricular activities and so on. I got the community to have tennis courts for school and so on. That's the sort of thing I enjoyed. So, but my fellow teachers tell me that they're not doing that sort of thing now. And I was at a party about 2 weeks ago. I hope this is not on tape, is it? Anyway, it was my young man who was helping with the garden through his 4 years university. And his mother and dad were going away, and Harold said, "Bessie, I want you to come to a party. I'm going to a dinner party, and we're going to have a vegetarian meal." So I said, well, Harold, have you got a cookbook? No. Vegetarian cookbook? No. But I said, well, I have one that tells you how to cook vegetables, at least, because it also tells you how to grow the vegetables, and then it gives you recipes to prepare these vegetables that you grow. So he was quite happy to get that. It was on Saturday evening. He said there would be his girlfriend and a couple other couples, university friends of his. And so the dinner was at 7, according to Harold, but he said, you can come around 5:30. And I got there about 6, and Harold had been struggling all day, and I could see that he really was concerned whether he was ever going to pull off this dinner. Eventually, we had dinner at 10, but then we were down in the family room in the fireplace, and his guests began to arrive, and they were all recent graduates. As I told Harold afterwards, I said, I was just enthralled about our conversation down there when you were upstairs struggling with your two friends, your two girlfriends, getting the dinner ready. And these young people were saying, one that is graduating from the School of Education here, that he thought he'd be able to get a job, but it wouldn't be in Victoria, and he was going to be somewhat disappointed because he'd have to go into the States, so to call, up the northern part of British Columbia. But generally, these young people were talking about how they were able to get through their classes with a minimum of effort, and except for the classes in which they wanted to excel, say in science, biology. One was a biologist. They didn't care whether they got C's or D's, as long as they could get through. And they weren't upset by the fact that they all had to write English, in the initial year. To me, I can't see us way back when I was going to university, in the 20s, thinking that was clever, or that was good enough. Because I'm quite sure, I asked Harold afterwards, and I was telling Harold how, astounded I was at the tenor of our conversation. And he was somewhat surprised. I said I was pleased that they were so frank,
Mm-hmm.
I said I don't think we would have been, we would have not have talked as openly and, unabashedly as they did. One, by the way, was a freelance photographer. Wasn't you, Ken? Anyway, that really did surprise me. And I said to this young man that was graduating in education, I said, Harold, is he fond of children? Because Harold is. And he said, yes, he is. He really is sincere. But I couldn't sense that, from his conversation. But you see, perhaps, I was being very, very critical. I didn't try to let my criticism show. I was listening. It was all ears. But, and we really had a lovely dinner. And Harold had a variety of casseroles and had salad. And his mother had made, before she had gone, a layer cake. And then the brother had helped Harold with the cream and put, raspberries. Yeah. And it was very fine. And they set the table nicely in the dining room. And we have a lovely dinner.
Sounds very nice.
Mm-hmm.
But that would be one of the things that you would find difficult if you were starting out again tomorrow, because your attitude is different from that of people.
I'm sure our attitude as young people, that we were so grateful that somehow, we had been able to scrape through and get to university. Mm-hmm. And that even though when we did apply, there were probably going to be 200 for our job, that we were one of the lucky ones. That, at least we weren't going to be some of the young people who were riding the rods, to get to another province. Or actually then, British Columbia was the mecca. People would come out here, see if they could get a job. But I think principally because it would be a milder climate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's easier to live. I'm wondering if in closing there's anything you'd like to add Anything you wish you'd said?
No, I think I've talked too long. I can't think of anything. I probably do when I get home. Think, well, why didn't I say this or that? But I can't think of this one.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon, sharing your thoughts and recollections with me and with the camera and the recorders. I found it very interesting, and I certainly appreciate very much this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Karen, and thank you too, Karen. And I must say I have enjoyed it, and I hope I have been helpful, but I can't see. Oh.
Yeah, you have. Thanks.